On April 14, 1935, a wall of black dust 3,000 feet tall rolled across the Great Plains and turned noon into midnight. Children breathed that storm into their lungs for 5 straight years. Number 12 on this list saved infants from a disease doctors had no name for until 1935. Number 4 grew in the one place the drought could not kill it. These are 25 Dust Bowl remedies that treated the disease that killed thousands of children. Number 25, wet cloth mask for dust pneumonia. Dust pneumonia was not pneumonia the way doctors understood the word in 1934. It was closer to suffocation by soil. Children who played outside during the worst storms inhaled fine particulate that lodged deep in lung tissue, and by the time the cough started, the damage had often already begun. A wet cloth tied over a child's face became the first line of defense the moment a black blizzard appeared on the horizon. Mothers soaked rags in water, sometimes vinegar water, for a mild antimicrobial boost before sending children the short distance from house to barn. It was crude. It was the only barrier most families had. And for the families who used it consistently, the difference in their children's lungs by spring was visible. Number 24, wet sheets on windows for dust filtration. Window seals failed constantly in farmhouses built for ordinary weather, never for storms that could bury a fence line in a single afternoon. Wet sheets hung over windows and door frames, trapped airborne particles, as fine grit tried to filter through gaps that no caulking could fully seal. The damp fabric worked through simple physics. Moisture caused particles to adhere to the cloth rather than pass through into the room where children slept. Families re-soaked the sheets every few hours through the worst storms, a chore so relentless that some mothers later described it as the defining labor of those years. What waited inside the house once the storm passed told you everything about whether the family had kept up with the soaking. Number 23, mineral oil to protect airways. A spoonful of mineral oil, taken before children went outside, coated the back of the throat and upper airway, theoretically trapping fine particulate before it traveled deeper into the lungs. Physicians at the time debated how much protection it genuinely offered, but families used it anyway, because the alternative was doing nothing while watching children develop the rattling cough that preceded the worst cases. Some communities organized informal protocols, dosing children before school in the towns where dust was heaviest. Nobody walking through a hospital ward in 1935 was inclined to question what seemed to be working, and the communities that used it consistently showed something worth noticing. Number 22, iodized salt for goiter. Goiter swelled across an entire belt of the country, running straight through the heart of Dust Bowl territory. And almost nobody understood why until the cause turned out to be hiding in plain sight. The Great Lakes to Rocky Mountain region had soil naturally depleted of iodine, producing visible thyroid swelling that gave the area its grim nickname, the Goiter Belt. Switching to iodized salt corrected a deficiency that had silently damaged thyroid function for generations. Families who made the switch during the Dust Bowl years were treating a problem that predated the drought by decades, and it was finally addressed after public health officials identified the cause. Number 21, sorghum molasses for nutrition. Sorghum, a crop more drought-tolerant than corn or wheat, continued producing even in seasons that destroyed other crops outright. The syrup pressed from its stalks became one of the few sweeteners families could reliably access, and it delivered iron and several B vitamins entirely absent from refined sugar. Families forced into the switch by economic necessity received nutritional benefits they never would have sought deliberately. Children who grew up on sorghum molasses over cornbread sometimes described it decades later with genuine nostalgia, a flavor permanently tied to survival rather than deprivation. Number 20, buttermilk and clabbered milk for digestion. Clabbered milk, left to sour naturally when refrigeration was a luxury few farm families had, developed beneficial bacterial cultures that supported digestion in children whose diets were otherwise dangerously monotonous. Families gave it specifically to children recovering from the stomach complaints that came with drinking well water, increasingly contaminated by drought-concentrated minerals. The sour taste that modern palates might reject was, in 1934 Oklahoma, simply what milk tasted like by the time anyone got around to drinking it. It was also, quietly, doing more for gut health than anyone in the household had a name for. Number 19. Lambsquarters for vitamins and iron. What grew where nothing else would. Lambsquarters, a weed that tolerated drought conditions that killed cultivated vegetables outright, delivered iron and vitamins that rivaled spinach. Families who recognized it growing along fence lines gathered it specifically because it survived where almost nothing else would. The bitter green that a wealthier family might have pulled as a weed became, during the worst drought summers, one of the only fresh vegetables some children saw for months at a stretch. The land was trying to bury them. And the one plant that would not stop growing was the one that happened to be medicine. Number 18. Russian thistle for emergency greens. Tumbleweed sounds like a joke ingredient in a survival story, and the families who actually ate it would tell you it tasted like one too. Russian thistle, the plant responsible for every iconic rolling tumbleweed in every Western film, was eaten as a last resort green by desperate families when nothing else survived the drought. Young tender shoots, harvested before the plant matured, provided genuine nutritional content. Government agricultural pamphlets from the period actually included tumbleweed recipes, official acknowledgement that survival sometimes meant eating what the rest of the country considered worthless. That detail has never made it into the popular version of this story. Here is what almost nobody who tells this story mentions. The federal government, through agencies that barely existed 5 years earlier, ran public health campaigns targeting Dust Bowl nutrition crises, distributing pamphlets on wild food identification, and organizing community canning programs. The Works Progress Administration built community gardens in towns where private gardens had failed completely. This was the first time in American history that the federal government treated regional malnutrition as a problem requiring direct coordinated intervention. That response reshaped how Americans would think about government's role in public health for the rest of the century. The families living through it just called it a neighbor showing up with seeds. Number 17. Soapweed for eye relief. Eye irritation from constant dust exposure left children rubbing swollen red eyes through entire school days, and the relief available came from an unlikely source. Soapweed, a yucca species common across the southern plains, produced a root that, when crushed and diluted in water, created a mild astringent wash families used to flush grit and reduce inflammation. The saponins responsible for the lathering quality also carried mild antimicrobial properties, meaning the wash did double duty against the secondary infections that sometimes followed days of constant airborne dirt exposure. Number 16. Plant and leaf for wounds and stings. Snake encounters were a constant danger on farms where rattlesnakes, displaced by the drought, turned up in barns and root cellars with unusual frequency. Plantain leaf, the same low, broad-leafed weed in every trampled yard, was chewed quickly and pressed against a bite or sting while someone ran for help. Allantoin in the leaf reduced local inflammation while the body's systems worked. Farm families who knew the plant treated it the way a modern family treats a first aid kit, not a guarantee, but the only thing available in the minutes that mattered most. Number 15. Onion syrup for coughs. A remedy old enough that nobody could say which generation had started making it. Onion syrup, made by layering sliced onions with sorghum and letting the mixture sit overnight until it released a thick liquid, delivered allicin and quercetin compounds with confirmed anti-inflammatory and mild antimicrobial properties directly to irritated throat tissue. Mothers gave it by the spoonful through the worst nights of dust storm coughing. The children who received it slept. The ones whose families had run out of onions did not. Number 14, lard salve for cracked skin. Skin cracked and bled across hands and faces exposed to constant wind and grit. And the remedy cost nothing because it came from animals families were already raising. Lard, rendered at home and sometimes mixed with whatever medicinal herb a family had managed to keep growing, became the base salve for chapped skin across the entire region. The fatty acid profile absorbed into damaged skin in ways that provided real barrier protection against further wind and dust exposure. Hands that cracked and bled by January softened measurably within days of consistent application. Number 13. Rickets appeared with unusual frequency in children whose diets had narrowed so severely that fat-soluble vitamins had disappeared from what they ate. Cod liver oil, distributed through relief programs where it could be obtained, delivered the vitamin D that sunlight alone was not providing, despite the relentless outdoor exposure most Dust Bowl children experienced daily. The bitter taste made administering it a daily battle in households where mothers had already exhausted their patience on every other crisis the drought had created. Public health nurses traveling rural circuits tracked rickets cases specifically because the nurses who looked knew where to look. Number 12. Prairie turnip for famine. Survival. This is the one that grew in the one place the drought could not kill it. Breadroot, wild prairie turnip, grew across the shortgrass prairie in conditions that destroyed cultivated crops, requiring no irrigation and no favorable weather to produce. Families who learned to identify and harvest it correctly gained access to a food source that had sustained Lakota and other Plains nations through the crisis of the 1930s. The knowledge transfer happened informally between neighboring families during the worst years, and it represented one of the only genuine success stories buried inside an otherwise catastrophic period. Number 11. Chokecherry preserves for vitamin C. Chokecherry stands survived along the few remaining watercourses that had not gone completely dry, and the fruit became more valuable during those years than it had ever been. Families who found a productive stand harvested every berry, cooking them into a preserve that delivered vitamin C at a moment when fresh fruit of any kind had become genuinely rare. The astringent quality of raw chokecherries made them difficult to eat directly, but cooked and sweetened with sorghum, they became one of the few treats children experienced during years when treats had largely disappeared from childhood. Number 10. Soapweed root for wound cleansing. The same yucca root used as an eye wash did double duty in households where manufactured soap had become an expense some families could no longer justify. Crushed with water into a lathering solution, soapweed root cleaned wounds with both the mechanical action of soap and the mild antimicrobial activity of the saponins themselves. Families who might have had access to commercial antiseptics in better years used this plant-derived alternative without losing meaningful wound protection. The kind of practical substitution that defined how Dust Bowl families adapted across every category of need simultaneously. Number 9. Wild plum for nutrition and diarrhea. Wild plum stands, Prunus americana, the small thorny trees along creek banks and fence rows across the plains, produced fruit that farm families gathered with urgency during the worst drought years. The plums delivered vitamin C, iron, and antioxidant compounds at a moment when cultivated fruit trees were dying from the same drought killing the crops. The bark, stripped and boiled, served as an astringent wash for diarrhea and sore throats. A single tree provided food, preserves, and medicine simultaneously, the kind of resource the Dust Bowl made essential. Number 8. Pellagra prevention through commodity foods. Pellagra crept through relief camps with a cruelty that built slowly, starting with skin lesions and ending, in untreated cases, with dementia and death. Niacin deficiency was the actual cause, unidentified by most rural physicians until well into the crisis. Families who accessed government commodity programs received foods naturally rich in the nutrient that reversed the condition within weeks when caught early. Pellagra became one of the Dust Bowl's least documented killers, simply because its connection to diet rather than dust made it invisible to the news coverage focused entirely on the storms. Number 7. Dandelion greens for nutrition. What most Dust Bowl families cursed as a weed was one of the most nutritionally complete plants growing in the cracked soil around them. Dandelion leaves, gathered before the flowers opened when bitterness was lowest, delivered iron, calcium, vitamins A, C, and K in concentrations that rivaled cultivated greens at a moment when cultivated greens had largely ceased to exist. Families and communities where someone knew the plant's nutritional value gathered it through seasons when the garden had otherwise failed completely. The weed that returned every spring, regardless of how bad the previous year had been, was, in that specific sense, the most reliable crop on the farm. Number 6. Rosehip tea for immune support. Wild rose bushes survived along fence rows and shelter belts when almost everything around them had died. And the bright red hips they produced through autumn and winter delivered vitamin C at a moment when the Dust Bowl diet had all but eliminated it. A handful of dried rose hips, steeped in hot water, provided more vitamin C than an orange, at a time when an orange was something children in these communities had stopped expecting. Families who gathered and dried rose hips in autumn were building a nutritional reserve against the winter months that no amount of government commodity flour could replace. Number 5. Heat exhaustion treatment with water and shade. Temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees across the plains through the worst summers, and heat exhaustion claimed lives that the dust storms themselves had spared. A damp cloth at the back of the neck, combined with whatever shade could be found, was the entire treatment protocol available to most rural families facing a relative who had collapsed from heat. Wells that had not yet run dry provided the only reliable source of cool water, and families learned to recognize the earliest signs of heat illness, because waiting for obvious symptoms often meant waiting too long. Number 4. Lambsquarters seed for flour. As the drought deepened, families who knew lambsquarters beyond the leaf discovered the seed as a second resource the plant offered. The small black seeds, ground into a rough flour, extended the family's grain supply and provided protein and micronutrients largely absent from the commercial relief flour distributed through government programs. Indigenous communities across the plains had used lambsquarter seed as a staple grain for centuries before European contact. It was a nutritional technology that desperate Dust Bowl families rediscovered through the same combination of observation and necessity that had produced it the first time. Number 3. Isolation protocols for diphtheria. Diphtheria moved through crowded relief camps with a speed that terrified public health officials. Antitoxin, when available, remained the only genuine treatment, but the shortage of medical supplies in remote camps meant families often relied on isolation and supportive care alone, keeping infected children separated and hydrated while hoping the disease ran a milder course than it sometimes did. The crowding in these camps, born entirely of displacement rather than choice, created exactly the conditions infectious disease needed to spread fastest. A cruel irony for families who had already lost everything. Number 2. Sunflower seeds for protein and oil. Prairie sunflower, growing wild across the disturbed soils the drought had scoured bare, produced seeds that farm families harvested and pressed for oil when commercial cooking fat had become unaffordable. The seeds provided vitamin E and significant protein at a moment when protein sources were dangerously limited for families who had already sold their livestock. Families who recognized the plant not as a weed, but as a crop perfectly adapted to drought conditions had access to nutrition that required nothing except the knowledge of what was growing beside the road. Number 1. Community as medicine for despair. The final remedy on this list was not something families grew, gathered, or made. It was something they did every single morning, regardless of how bad the night before had been. Community gathering, whether at a church, a relief office, or simply a neighbor's kitchen table, functioned as genuine medicine for a crisis that was as much psychological as physical. Families who maintained regular contact with neighbors reported, in oral histories collected decades later, significantly better outcomes for the kind of despair that drove some Dust Bowl residents to genuine collapse. The Plains had always valued community. During these specific years, that value became something closer to a survival mechanism. Isolation in a landscape actively trying to bury you was its own kind of danger. 25 remedies from a crisis that displaced over 2 million people and killed thousands of children with a disease nobody had a name for until the storms had already been blowing for years. The families who survived did not survive because the government solved everything, though for the first time it tried. They survived because mothers soaked rags before every storm, because someone remembered which weeds along the fence line could still be eaten, because a neighbor showed up with onion syrup the night a child's cough would not stop. Subscribe to Forgotten American Ways. The dust settled eventually. The knowledge almost did not survive with it.